are on the final installment of the end of Cold War. Now, our focus for this lesson is going to be on Gorbachev's reforms. All right. Now, in our previous lesson, we talked about the reasons why the USSR was rapidly declining and was becoming communism was becoming more and more unpopular in Eastern Europe as well as USSR. Now, in this lesson, we are going to see how Gorbachev, the USSR's youngest leader, attempts to try and rejuvenate the communist economy. All right. So some of the reforms that Gorbachev's undertake would be the domestic policies of glasnost and perestroika, foreign policy reforms, and ideologization of Soviet foreign policy. Okay, now Mikhail Gorbachev was elected at the age of 54, and he replaced Konstantin Chernenko as the leader. Now, he believed that the USSR could be transformed with new ideas and new ways of thinking. Now, he did not intend to dismantle communism in USSR and Eastern Europe, but instead he wanted to reform it radically, all right? So he saw his approach as a new thinking, a new way of doing things. Okay, now let's take a look at the political cartoon here. You see an artist's impression of the USSR. Hitting the vodka is a term used to describe excessive drinking of vodka, an alcoholic drink closely associated with the USSR during the Cold War. Okay, so what is being shown in this particular political cartoon? You can see that you have USSR with some kind of a wheel over here. Okay, and you have Gorbachev's reforms coming in. You could see the word remodeling and renovation. All right. The big question here is they are asking, has Comrade Mike here, Mike being Mikhail Gorbachev, been hitting the vodka, meaning has he been drinking? All right. Because at the end of the day, a lot of them were not very hopeful that whatever policies that he was he was implementing, they felt that it may not actually work. Okay, so people were actually quite pessimistic about the reforms that he was undertaking. So what were the what do the names glasnost and perestroika actually mean? Now, glasnost actually means openness, while perestroika means restructuring. All right, and these were key domestic reforms. Now, what do I mean by domestic reforms? These were reforms that were implemented to transform the USSR and improve the lives of the people living in Soviet Union. Okay. So we're not talking about the Eastern European nations. We're talking about what do you call that? Gorbachev's attempt to improve Soviet economy. Now, glasnost, also known as openness, okay, did mean to bring about radical changes, and it would allow for open political debate by Communist Party members. All right, meaning that people could actually discuss what they felt about a particular policy or reform. They could actually disagree with whatever the government was putting forward. All right, so this would also allow criticism of the government in the media. So the idea here was, let USSR become a more open nation so that we could hear the people's voices, and hearing the people's voices would allow them to fix what would be the shortcomings of the nation. All right. So that was the intent of glasnost. However, it backfired because it exposed the inefficiency and corruption that was in the Soviet government instead. It also exposed Soviets to aspects of the outside world where they could actually see that in non-communist countries, they could see for themselves that people were enjoying better qualities of life. So they saw the way the people in the U.S., the kind of life that the people in the U.S. were living. All right, people in the Western Europe were living. Okay, they actually saw what popular Western culture looked like, and then they compared their life against what they saw, and they realized that they did not have did not have a good life under a communist regime. So what it led to was people's confidence being eroded, and they realized that whatever that the government had promised them about the positive aspects of Soviet life was actually not uh, very true. It was actually, they felt that they had been deceived by the government, that they did not actually enjoy a good quality of life. It created, unfortunately, a platform for criticism of communist rule, and people became more confident to speak out against the policies. And whatever positive image that the government, the Soviet life presented, was now eroded. Now, what about perestroika? What does that mean? Now, it was also known as restructuring, and this was looking at a series of political and economic reforms, okay, that was supposed to take place. So managers in companies and industries, they were actually encouraged to innovate and try new approaches, and they didn't have to really seek permission from the government, because they felt that all this uh, process of seeking permission, getting clearances, was actually slowing everything down. So they said, if you're in a position that allows you to make decisions, why not you try new ways of doing things and implement them, all right, firsthand, all right. Managers were also encouraged to involve workers in discussions and decision making about their businesses. So the idea here was, we want to hear more voices, all right. So it's not just about top down approach, but we want to hear everyone, we want to give everyone some say in how things are done. Okay, so the whole idea is to actually encourage new ideas, increase efficiency, and fight corruption. All right. So in 1987, perestroika allowed market forces to be introduced. It means that for the first time in 60 years, it was no longer illegal to buy and sell for profit. Now imagine, all right, it took them 60 years to do this. However, this policy failed, as there was no overall increase in output. All right. Moreover, there were chronic problems of unemployment, growth of black markets, and shortages in basic necessities, especially, we're talking about consumer items that were still severely in shortage, all right? So we find that there were conflicting methods of cooperative ownership here. Private ownership of small businesses were permitted, but the state still controlled over the means of production. So it's kind of like ironic. You want people to start their own businesses, but the state still held control over means of production. So the state still decided what was to be produced, what resources you needed, and who was to get these resources. All right. So if I am starting a new business, I would have to wait my turn or in the queue, and my turn will not come very soon, because though I would only be attended to after the government has already given out everything to the others, that to the businesses that are state run. So I will my private business will have to take a back seat and wait for my turn. All right. And on top of that, small businesses had to pay high taxes and deal with dishonest officials. Like, whenever they needed clearance for anything, you needed to pay under table money so that your paperwork will get done, so that you're given the permission to move ahead and get whatever that you need, so that the resources that you need is given to you. So there's a lot of dishonest officials who were actually causing a delay. So even if people wanted to start private ownership of business, really, it was not something that was that easy. All right. The infrastructure, such as road storage facilities for agriculture, was still inadequate. So what this means is that sometimes the agricultural produce, which was supposed to make its way to the city area, because of poor infrastructure, they were not able to move all the way to the city. So they'll be abandoned in the middle of nowhere. And the products, and you know that when we talk about agricultural product, they have a lifespan. So they will begin to rot and decompose. All right. So there was a lot of wastage because of the fact that infrastructure such as roads and storage facilities were not there. Okay. So many Soviet citizens also lost interest in setting up their own businesses because of the way things were. Political reforms under perestroika also did not achieve what it intended. All right. There was a lot of criticism of Gorbachev by both party conservatives and radicals who opposed him. And there was a rise of various opposition groups in the government who felt that Gorbachev's policies were ineffective. Okay. Um, of course, Gorbachev was eager to bring his new thinking to foreign policy and the role of the military in the USSR. So, what he did was he began to cut spending on defense. And after almost 50 years of massive investment and preparations for war with the US and its allies, the Red Army began to shrink, all right, because these he felt were unnecessary expenses, and these expenses, this money, all right, could be actually channeled elsewhere. So that was his intention when he was cutting down on all these military expenses. All right, but he was realistic enough to recognize that the USSR could not hope, and he was also realistic enough to recognize that the USSR could not hope to outspend the US on nuclear weapons. And this is a fact because of the fact that USSR's economy was growing far slowly compared to USA. Where are you going to get the funds to actually, compete effectively or on the same level as USA? He was very realistic. It's not possible. So, 2 years later, the US and the USSR signed a treaty to remove most of their missiles from Europe. At the same time, Gorbachev brought a new attitude to the USSR's relation with the world. Now, he began to withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan, and he talked about international trust and cooperation rather than confrontation as the way forward for USSR. So, enough is enough. We're not going to send our military forces over to all these countries, because at the end of the day, they did lead to a lot of unnecessary expenses. The Reagan-Gorbachev summits, all right, now we're looking at how US President watched the developments in the USSR with great interest. And he was shocked to discover that the Soviets had almost launched a nuclear strike against the US in 1983. And it was only a malfunction in the Soviets' early warning system that made them think that the US had fired missiles at the USSR. Okay? Reagan was keen to advance nuclear disarmament and to tamp down the strategic arms race, all right? And these priorities led Reagan to make overtures to Soviet leaders and to eventually engage Gorbachev in negotiations with a shared commitment to nuclear abolition. So at the end of the day, it was very simple, all right? Neither side stood to gain by using nuclear weapons against each other, all right? So Reagan realized that it was high time that he also came down and tried to negotiate with Gorbachev. And given the fact that Gorbachev was very friendly and he was not such a hardliner as the previous rulers had been, Reagan was able to work with him. Okay, so between 85 to 88, Reagan and Gorbachev had 5 summit meetings. By the end of these summits, they had reached an agreement to further reduce their nuclear weapons. And Reagan declared that he no longer thought that the USSR was an evil empire because of the changes that Gorbachev was actually making. As part of Gorbachev's commitment towards a new thinking at home and abroad, Soviet foreign policy underwent a change known as ideologization. Now, this meant an end to all ideologically driven engagements designed to promote communism globally and challenge the US. So, whatever that they were doing in the past to try and spread communism or to strengthen communism globally, all right, they put an end to this. Okay, and then there was no longer the need to actually compete with the USA. All right, so they kind of like agreed to coexist peacefully. All right, Gorbachev recognized that in order to successfully reform the Soviet economy, he had to first reduce the large amounts of money being spent overseas in superpower competition with the US. So that means peaceful relationship with US was very, very important. All right, so that he could successfully reduce the large amounts of money. Now, under Gorbachev, the USSR would also no longer intervene in other countries to support communist regimes or takeovers as it had done under former leaders such as Brezhnev. So what this means is that if, let's say, there is a revolution in an Eastern European country, the USSR will not intervene by sending in military support, okay, economics, giving it monetary finances to back the communist regime to prevent the takeover of another system of government. So they would basically not intervene in any of the Eastern European countries, all right? If there is any such attempt to actually overthrow the communist regime or maybe even to expand communism. All right, so to demonstrate his commitment towards ideologization, Gorbachev withdrew troops from military engagements in various parts, such as Afghanistan and Angola, alongside Soviet support for communist regimes in Cuba and Vietnam. So there was gradual withdrawal, okay? And Gorbachev was also prepared to tell the communist leaders of the Eastern European nations who were unwilling to compromise that they had to change as well. So he made it very clear to these hardliners in Eastern Europe that, look, we are not going to, provide you with any military backing or finances in order to sustain this communist regime in your country. All right, you need to deal with your own problems yourself. All right. In 1989, Gorbachev called the leaders of the Warsaw Pact countries together. He explained that they were now committed to a policy of non-intervention in the affairs of their countries. So he jokingly referred to this policy as the Sinatra Doctrine, named after the famous singer Frank Sinatra, who basically sang the song My Way. In other words, Gorbachev was telling Eastern European states that they could and should go their own way, all right, and not depend on USSR. Okay, so we can see very clearly that Gorbachev's policies did see about changes in a relationship between the USA and USSR. It did really contribute to the easing of tensions between the US and USSR, all right? How important were they? They were actually very important, okay? They did bring about a positive change in the relationship between the two nations. Now, unfortunately, this also means that communism collapsed in the USSR. So let's see how this happened, okay? Now, with the reforms being introduced, the demands for more and more reforms actually grew across Eastern Europe. Gorbachev made a speech at the Warsaw Pact summit, stating his intention to withdraw large numbers of Soviet troops, tanks, and aircraft from other communist states. Now, he reinforced these intentions in the speech to the Polish parliament soon after. And he made it very clear to the Warsaw Pact leaders that the Soviet army would leave Eastern Europe and would no longer prop their countries up and ensure that communism remained was the system of government in place. All right, and at the end of the day, these leaders would have to listen to their people's voices. So in the months that followed, there was a sudden and dramatic collapse of communism across Eastern Europe. And this should not come as a surprise, because all the while there was a lot of protest. There was attempts to actually overthrow the communist system of regime. All right, but it was communism only survived because of the fact that there was the Brezhnev Doctrine. There was this support and support from the Soviet Union to ensure that the communism stayed alive in the Eastern European countries. Even the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the Cold War and the communist control of Eastern Europe, could not withstand the pressure, all right? So in November 1989, the Guards abandoned the Berlin Wall and jubilant crowds began to dismantle it. So they broke the Berlin Wall, all right? And you see that more and more nations in Europe were beginning to dismantle the wire fence between Hungary and non-communist Austria and so on, because they no longer wanted to remain communist. Solidarity, remember Solidarity, we talked about it earlier, won 99 out of 100 seats in Poland's Senate at the June elections. Protests against communist rule in Poland continued to take place throughout the summer. And so you can imagine what is likely to happen in Poland very soon. Sooner than later, you would see that communism would collapse, all right? Now, in September, thousands of East Germans on holiday in Hungary and Czechoslovakia refused to go home. They escaped through Austria into West Germany rather than to go back to, East Germany. Gorbachev visited East Germany and made a key speech urging all Eastern European leaders to reform their countries. He made it clear that the USSR would not use troops to keep them in power. Hungary declared itself a democratic republic rather than a communist republic. So imagine, Hungary had already abandoned communism, all right? So the largest demonstration in East Germany's history took place as over 1 million people demanded for democracy and free elections in East Berlin. The East German government announced the opening of the border and lifting of the Berlin Wall on the evening of 9 November. Okay, so this literally marks the fall of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In Czechoslovakia, huge demonstrations forced the communist leaders to resign, resulting in the opening of its borders with the West. In June 1990, it held free elections. Massive demonstrations led to the collapse of the communist regimes in Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania. All right, so communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe, but it was not quite the end of the USSR or the Cold War yet, because even more dramatic events were to follow in USSR itself. Now, in January 1990, the leaders in the Baltic state of Lithuania, which was part of the USSR, made it clear that they wanted independence. They did not want to be a part of the USSR. Gorbachev was for once uncompromising. Nevertheless, in March, Lithuania declared its independence. Through it all, Russian President Boris Yeltsin emerged as a key figure. So it's very interesting that USSR itself was now collapsing. Okay, territories within USSR did not want to be a part of the USSR. Okay, so the change in the Soviet policy from the Brezhnev Doctrine to the Sinatra Doctrine saw a shift from the centralized Moscow control to the freedom for the Eastern European states to choose their own government. And not surprisingly, communism was the unpopular government. All right, so it collapsed. All right. This had an impact on Central Soviet leadership and eventually paved the way for the collapse of the USSR. All right, now you turn to your textbook, page 163, to learn about the series of events that led to the demise of the USSR. So the first thing we're going to look at is the demands for independence from Lithuania and the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. All right, then there was election of Yeltsin as president of the Russian Republic, and it was the largest republic in the USSR. There was a declaration of independence from the republics. All of them, one by one, they were basically declaring independence from USSR. Hardliners and leading military officers attempted a coup to take over the USSR, but of course, this is not going to work anymore. Huge crowds gathered in Moscow to oppose the coup. And Gorbachev announces resignation as president of the USSR, and this marks the end of USSR. So you could see that the timeline, how very quickly even the USSR communism in USSR begins to collapse. So how did the events between 1990 and 1991 hasten the process of the collapse of the USSR? The increased call for independence from other republics in the USSR placed intense pressure on Gorbachev to make political changes, and this heightens as Boris Yeltsin was democratically appointed as Russia's president, which he began to make proposals to detach his republic from the larger Soviet system. So basically, remember that Russia is only a part of USSR, just like how Lithuania is a part of USSR. But all these two nations want to be independent. They do not want to be a part of the USSR. All right. So Gorbachev was blamed for allowing the hardliners behind it to reach high positions of power based on the failed coup attempt. While the USSR collapsed in 1991, there were many long-term and underlying factors that contributed to it. This included the various weaknesses of the Soviet economy, the overextension of the Soviet military, and the US policy of containment. Now, the rivalry between the US and USSR played out through the nuclear arms race and involvement in conflicts around the world. But this led to a large burden on the Soviet economy, which was actually not progressing as rapidly as the American economy. So these created the conditions that led to Gorbachev's desire for reforms, but unfortunately, the reforms did not play out the way that he hoped. Instead, it triggered a series of events that eventually led to the collapse of communism in every other country in Eastern Europe. So with the disintegration of the USSR, the Cold War and the competition between the two countries also effectively came to an end. Now, the Cold War was a long and complex conflict as both the US and USSR were troubled by anxieties. There was the ever-present threat of nuclear war, all right, but thankfully neither side actually lost their cool enough to actually use the nuclear weapons against each other. All right. In some ways, it was surprising that the USSR lasted so long, given the fact that the US had vastly greater economic resources than the USSR. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of surprising that USSR actually did manage to compete with the USA for a period of time. What we see as what were the reasons for the end of Cold War, these are the various factors. Number one, the decline of USSR, US economic and military superiority, Gorbachev's reforms, Reagan's rule, remember the Star Wars project, collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, all of which paved the way for the end of Cold War. All right, with this, we've come to the end of this lesson on how the Cold War came to an end. Okay, please log into your SLS to actually review your work by going in and trying out the SLS questions. All right, thank you.